Okay, I'd now like to walk around the control box to show you the different areas and different features before we have a look at it in more detail. So we have a plastic enclosure, IP rated to IP55. It's designed to be a standalone control box in that it plugs directly into a mains AC power supply. It doesn't require any additional transformers. And it's fully plug and play once the main power connection is made. So all other connections to and from the box are plug and play. Connections are made to the box from the buttons or activation buttons on the product and from the box to the water device by these inputs and outputs on the front panel here. The larger holes are the 12 volt DC outputs, and the smaller holes take 3.5mm stereo jack plug inputs. In order to activate the box, the input is closed. So these are normally open volt-free inputs which we close to activate. The activation devices supplied by Wallgate are typically a piezo button, which is an electronic switch, very secure, no moving parts, very vandal resistant. This example here is a WC control button, which has the 3.5mm input, which we'll just plug in simply to one of the inputs like that. In addition to the piezo button, Wallgate also provide a range of infrared sensors which also work with the WDC200 in the same way. Again, it's just plug and play into the input. In addition to these, simple tactile switches can also be used, because again, all we're looking to do is to close the input. For the output, again, a plug and play connection is provided, and Wallgate use a 3-pin microphone connector with a positive locking device. So again, this just plugs into the box. Once installed, is locked in with that with the pin. And this is an example of a typical water solenoid. This is a 15mm water solenoid, compression fittings on the inlet and outlet, typical of the water control device. Okay, those are connections to the box. In addition to these, we have the display on the front of the box, which gives user feedback as to which outputs are running, and also allows you to configure the functionality of the control box. Directly beneath the display is a series of 4 buttons which allow programming to be done within the menu. There's also some shortcuts on these buttons which allow you to quickly navigate to the more readily used features of the control box. And there's also a fuse on the front of the box here, a 1-amp fuse. To expand on the inputs and outputs, the top row typically is for room 1 and the bottom row is for room 2. We then have these additional inputs on the side of the box, these 6. Now these are auxiliary inputs which can be configured within the menu structure to run different operations, which we'll expand on a bit later. And finally, there's 2 RJ45 ports here to take our Cat5 or a Cat6 cable. This allows the control boxes to be joined together on a daisy chain and networked back to either a Wallgate front-end PC running our own proprietary software or integrated with a BMS system should one exist. We'll now look at the functionality of the control box. Okay, now we have the control box mounted in this display stand, which is designed to represent the controller in its normal environment, which is operating one room worth of sanitary ware here and another room worth of sanitary ware here. We have piezo buttons wired in as if they were local to the actual sanitary ware appliances. And then here we have activation lights which represent the solenoid valves. If a light is on, it represents valve open and water flowing. Now, it's worth pointing out that the controller is pre-configured at the factory before dispatch. So when it arrives, it is in a state which is ready to be used straight out of the box. However, there are quite a few functions which can be altered or adapted to have the unit better suit the application. But generally it is set up to have automatic timed flow straight out of the box. So to go through the menu and the setup procedures, we will first of all get into the menu, and we do this by holding down the menu button and the return button for about 5 seconds until the backlight comes on. Okay, so we're in. The first thing it's come up with is the firmware version. The firmware version is important. If you ever need to contact Wallgate about the control box, we'd like to know the firmware. Also, the firmware is updatable, which allows bespoke firmware to be written, bespoke functionality to be written, should that ever be required. It just allows the box to be adaptable. Okay, we use the navigation keys, the up and down arrows and the enter button to get around the menu and to select and alter different parameters. I'm going to use the down arrow to move to the next step, which is System Settings Management. This screen here contains some setup information, and really this is, you would use this once. It's set and forget. We hit enter to get into it, and the first thing we have here is a system test. The system test is there to help the installer. There's a lot going on with these boxes when they're installed. There's a lot of cables coming in and out in a small space here, and it can get a bit busy. So what this feature is doing is it's helping identify simply that the correct button is plugged into the correct socket and the correct valve is plugged into the correct socket. This is done by, you'll see on the legend that the inputs and outputs are identified alphanumerically. And we can see also from the legend what the numbers and letters mean. So here we have 1A, 1 being WC in room 1 output, and A being the input for WC room 1. If we activate the system test by pressing the return button, disabled begins to flash, and we now use the arrow keys to select enabled. So we're now in system test mode. If we press, for instance, the WC button, we'll see that A comes up on the screen and the light comes on. This is directly copying the input to the output. So we know that we have the right button connected to the right socket and the corresponding light is coming on. That's the same for all other buttons. Every button has a number and every light has a letter. So as long as the correct output triggers for the correct input, we know we've got the right connections made. Okay, the next function is a feature here called Exclusivity. Exclusivity affects how the sanitary ware can be used. This is really a feature for the secure environment. As I said in the introduction, there's a lot of features on this control box which will limit how water is dispensed. It's there to safeguard against misuse of the water services. Now, what Exclusivity does is, when activated, it will allow only one function to happen at any one time. With it deactivated, we can run the basin hot, basin cold, the shower, we can flush the loo in both rooms all at the same time. Now, if Exclusivity was enabled, then only one outlet can only ever run at one time. Also, on the basin, the hot and cold buttons will interrupt each other. With Exclusivity disabled, both basin hot and cold buttons can run at the same time. Now, we can also see from the display, if you leave it, will go back to its normal ready state. I've spoken for too long here, so it's gone back to normal. But we can see that we have some feedback as well. The display is always telling us what's going on. It's telling us that the shower is running and is counting down the remaining time that the shower has left to run. So you always have some feedback on the display. Just go back into the menu. Next we have water lockouts enabled. Again, this is a feature for reducing the amount of water available over a particular time. Standard feature for the secure environment is water lockouts. Enabled puts the default settings in. We'll get to that shortly. If this was disabled, then the use of the sanitary ware within the room is unlimited. Timed flow will operate as normal, but you can use the device as many times as you wish. The shortcuts on the front of the box, which we mentioned earlier, there is a lockout on and off shortcut on the box here. It is a useful one. Although lockouts are pre-programmed, the controllers are sent out with lockouts disabled. This is because when the box is being installed and the systems are being commissioned, having the box lock out can be a real nuisance when they're trying to run larger volumes of water. So we send the box out with lockouts disabled, and they can easily be activated with this shortcut here. The next feature is mode and defaults. There's two modes that the box can be in. It can either be designed to operate or programmed to operate in a cell environment. This is where we have the timed flow for all the outputs, and we have these lockouts we just mentioned. Another option is the communal environment. When in communal mode, a lot of the management features in the box are overruled, and now it is just a simple 8-channel controller. It gives you 8 channels worth of timed flow. Typically, communal mode may be used when operating a bank of showers. You could have one unit operating up to 8 showers in a row, but there's very little other management which may be specific to a shower or to a basin or to a WC pan. Okay, we then come to system sharing. System sharing is a function if there is just one system being shared between 2 WC pans. What this basically does is after a WC pan is flushed, there's a period where the button is effectively inoperative, which gives the system time to refill. If you have if you have one system being shared, then if the user in room 1 was to flush his WC, the user in room 2 would need to wait until the system had refilled before they could activate their WC pan. However, if the unlikely situation happened where they did activate the WC pan whilst it was refilling, the pan would flush automatically once the system had refilled. Next is high voltage flush disabled. Just a note here, all the outputs are at 12 volts. The total electrical rating for the box is 50 watt at 12 volts, so we mustn't exceed 50 watt. There are some WC flush valves on the market which use a higher voltage to drive the coil. When high volt flush is enabled, the flush valve outputs operate at 30 volts. Again, something that isn't used very often but is useful to have in there. Next we come to double press flush disabled. Really this is dual flush. The WDC unit supports dual flush as standard, and it will do this either with a single button dual flush or 2 separate buttons. This rig shows 2 separate buttons. We've got WC full flush and WC half flush. You can achieve the same thing through one button, where you would tap the button once for a short flush, or you would tap it twice in quick succession for a full flush. Okay, next we come to IR inputs, short for infrared inputs. The controller will support infrared inputs. These are active infrareds, and when this is activated by pressing the down button and then the enter button, it will supply 12 volt DC out of the input to the infrared sensor. When this is not activated, the inputs are totally volt free. Next is set time and date, pretty self-explanatory. You can also get to set time and date through a shortcut on the menu, on the label here, these front two buttons. There is a real time clock in the box. It knows what time of day it is, it knows what the date is, and there's other functionality which we'll see a bit later on which feeds off this time and date. Remote input setup. This is a useful one. We mentioned earlier that there's these auxiliary inputs which are assignable here to the right hand side of the control box. Just to run through the options, what we have here is remote input I, so we're talking about, we look on the menu, the lower input down here, I is currently remote lockout. Now this rig here, we've attached the auxiliary inputs to a key switch. This is quite typical of the secure environment where outside a patient's room or an inmate's cell or something similar, there may be a secure switch plate which will allow you to either lock out the room, for instance, or maybe purge one of the outputs. So I've got this set up for this demo, but to run through the options, we can choose between remote lockout, which when activated, this box, this room effectively becomes dead without switching off the power to the control box. If we switch that back on, we see we get our functionality back. And we can switch it off. Okay, so from remote lockout we can also choose remote flush. Again, I've got my key switch set up on a remote flush, and what this will let you do is automatically flush the WC pan from a remote location away from the WC itself. Again, it's a function which is normally found in the secure environment. Going on from remote flush, we have half flush. Again, I'm using this. You would select a half flush auxiliary if you have two flush buttons to achieve your dual flush. More often than not now, you find people just using one button for the dual flush rather than two separate ones. However, if that was activated, we would have half a flush on this button here. And clear lockouts. Clear lockouts is, we'll see a bit later on that you can limit the amount of operations available to a user within a certain amount of time. These are known as lockouts. So for instance, you might only be allowed to use the Basin 10 times in an hour, and then the box will automatically shut down for a period of time. Now if that happens, if the box is in lockout mode, it will automatically reset after a preset time. However, using or activating the clear lockout input will, as it says, clear the lockouts. Typically with remote functions such as clear lockouts, the input is taken away from the box, and Wallgate do a range of switch plates to activate these auxiliary features, but it could be as simple as just a tactile switch mounted somewhere in a secure location. If it's in a secure location isn't secure, as I say, we do have stainless steel anti-vandal switch plates and key switches. Okay, moving on from remote input setup, we have load factory settings. Again, if you get yourself into a right muddle, activating load factory settings just brings you back to the default. Moving on from there, we have network address. This is going back to the ability of the controllers to be networked via the RJ45 connections on the front. Each box on that network would need its own address. So here we assign the address. We can be anywhere between 1 and 30, which means you can have up to 30 devices on a string. You can have as many strings as you wish, but each box on that string must have its own unique address, and we would choose that again by pressing enter and using the navigation keys to select the next free address. That's the end of system settings management. Okay, following on from there, we have our water settings. Water settings is where you'll find all your run times, your lockout times, the way that the actual timed flow is set up and works. So we're starting off with cell 1 water settings. We hit enter to get into the system, and the first thing we have is Basin cold cycle time 10 seconds. So when we press our Basin cold, we'll have an automatic time flow of 10 seconds. If we want to adjust that, we hit enter and the 10 seconds starts flashing. We use the up and down arrows to choose whatever value we like. We have a resolution of 1 second on this. We go for 9 seconds just to show. Then using the arrows, we choose the Basin hot cycle time. Again, the same thing. At the moment we have a 10-second run time. This is the box's default. If we pressed enter, we could alter this runtime to be whatever is required. Coming down again, we have Basin cycle activations. This is part of the lockout feature. This will allow you to, we can see it says 10, this will allow you to use the Basin 10 times in an amount of time. Again, the 10 can be adjusted to whichever value is suitable for the application. 10 is the default. Coming down again, we have Basin cycle period. This is the period in time of which those 10 operations are allowed. It defaults to 60 minutes. Again, the 60 minutes can be adjusted in resolution of 15-minute steps. So we can go down to a minimum of 15 minutes. If you wanted to be less than that, we'd have to switch the lockouts off. Or we can go right the way up to thousands of hours. We'll leave it at 60 minutes, which is the default. And then the Basin lockout time. So assuming that you've run the box into lockout by using the Basin more than 10 times in the period of time, in the 60 minutes, this will now shut that product down for an amount of time. So this is your lockout time. And again, it defaults to 60 minutes, which can be adjusted just like previously. Resolution of 15 minutes. Down to 15 minutes, up to many thousand. And then we have the same series of questions, same series of settings for the shower. So we have the shower run time, we have the amount of activations that you're allowed in the period, and then the amount of time that the shower would lock out for should the maximum be exceeded. We then come to the WC. Again, very similar, but there's a couple of different functions in here as the WC behaves slightly differently. We start off with the full cycle, so this is your full flush. Our resolution has increased to tenths of a second. This will allow you to be very accurate with the amount of water that's dispensed when the button is pressed. We send the box out with a default setting of 3.3 seconds, which flushes approximately 6 litres of water from one of our standard systems. Again, as I say, the resolution is in tenths of a second here. The second setting is the reduced time. So dual flush, this is now your reduced flush, and we have here just over half the value. This is set up to give us about 4 litres. So our dual flush is set at 6 litres full flush, 4 litres reduced. But again, you can flush whatever volume is required by altering this time. We then, just like the other ones, have the activation, so this will allow you to use the toilet pan 4 times, and we go down to the next one, to the cycle period, 4 times in 15 minutes. If you overdo it, it will lock out, which is our next screen, for 15 minutes. Again, all of this can be adjusted. The next function is WC refill time. This defaults to 30 seconds, and this is a delay built in to allow time for the system to refill after the WC flush button is pressed. So you would press the WC button, the WC would flush automatically, and then this button was now effectively out of operation for 30 seconds to allow the system to refill with water. Again, totally adjustable. The 30-second refill time is suitable if there's a traditional system being used. Now we know that there's other ways of flushing the WC pan. Wallgate supply many direct flush solutions to WC flushing utilising a valve such as this. If a direct flush type valve was being used, then the WC refill time could be significantly less, maybe just 1 or 2 seconds to allow the system to rebalance. Moving on from there, we have a copy function. So after you spent all that time setting up cell 1 or room 1, you can copy your settings across from room 1 to room 2, or vice versa. And that brings us back to the beginning. So this is your water setup. Incidentally, should the boxes be networked, all of these settings are available on drop-down tabs, which makes fine-tuning all of these parameters probably a bit more straightforward. It's less of a linear menu. Coming away from the cell 1 or room 1 water settings, we have cell 1 time slots. Now this is a feature that taps into the real-time clock function and is there to allow certain products to only operate at certain times of the day. It's a very useful feature if it can be used, which can really manage the water use over a period of time. If we just go into the menu, we see here we start off with Basin 1 time slot. So this is Basin in room 1, and setting this will allow periods of time when that basin is going to be active. It defaults to all 24 hours of the day, but should you want to make amendments to that, the day is split up into 4 slots, 4 different segments of the day, and we can say that the basin would only become active between the hours of, say, 7 o'clock AM and 9 o'clock PM, and it's dead throughout for the nighttime periods. Another time this is used regularly would be on the showers in a secure environment, and this would again to limit when the showers are in use, and you could possibly tailor the regime of the establishment to fit in with this, or for this to fit in with the regime. So that you know that the showers will not be running at certain times of the day when perhaps they shouldn't be used. It's a way of just managing that supply very well. We also know that showers are one of the most water consuming devices that's ever going to be attached to one of these controls, and limiting its use in that way is quite a powerful function. That's time slots. We have the same settings available for Basin, WC and shower, and we can have different settings between room 1 and room 2, so I won't go into the finite detail here. Next choice is the same time slots for room 2. We then come down to hygiene setting. Again, this is a feature that taps into the real-time clock functionality, and this will allow the box to automatically purge or automatically open its outlets if a product or if a item of sanitary ware hasn't been used in a certain amount of time. So if we just go into here, we have Basin inactivity period. So we're looking at the time that the basin has been inactive for. It defaults to off, so this feature defaults to off, but if we enter here, the resolution is in hours and can be set each hour. A typical setting might be 48 hours. So if the basin is set to an inactivity period of 48 hours, after 48 hours, the control box would automatically purge that outlet. And the next query in the menu is the basin purge time defaults to 60 seconds. So if it hadn't been used for 48 hours, then the basin will automatically run for 60 seconds. Again, this is a very useful feature in healthcare. It's to safeguard against waterborne diseases, stagnating water, your traps running dry and creating foul smells, etc. A really good one for an anti-Legionella device. Same questions for basin, shower and WC. And that concludes the menu functions and available settings of the WDC200 control box. One final word, all of these settings that we looked at are held in non-volatile memory. So once the box is set up, if the power is switched off to the box, then all of these settings are retained. The only function that is reset on a power cycle is the lockouts. So if the box was halfway through counting its lockouts and you reset the power, it basically resets the lockout function, which is again quite a useful feature if you don't have the auxiliary lockout reset attached. More information and user manuals are available on our website www.wallgate.com.